Welcome to Night Vale Whispers. I'm here to keep you company as you drift off tonight. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where are you watching from and what time is it. Now, get comfortable and let the stories begin. Story 1. The last door in the attic never stays shut. They told me every old house settles, but they never explained what settles behind the last door in the attic. The house was a compromise, as most things in life are. It was older than I would have liked, and farther from anything resembling a city, but it was what I could afford. It stood on a modest plot of land, flanked by tall, whispering pines, with a certain weary dignity to its peeling paint and slightly crooked porch. It was a place to be alone, to heal from the noise of a previous life. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what it was, quiet. The silence was a balm, broken only by the groan of the pipes or the sigh of the wind through the eaves. The attic was the last room I explored. It was a duty, not a discovery, a place to store the cardboard-boxed ghosts of my past. A pull-down staircase unfolded from the ceiling of the upstairs hallway with a dusty sigh. The air up there was thick and still, smelling of ancient wood and forgotten things. It was a long, triangular space, bisected by the massive trunk of the central chimney. Along one wall, under the low, sloping roof, were 4 doors. 3 of them were unremarkable. They opened into shallow, cedar-lined closets, empty save for a few stray cobwebs. But the 4th door, at the far end of the attic, was different. It was small, no more than 3 feet high, cut directly into the wall beneath the lowest point of the roof. It was painted the same dusty white as the rest of the wall, but it felt older, as if it were part of the house's original bones. There was no handle, just a small, tarnished brass latch. I didn't think much of it, a crawl space, probably, leading to wiring or insulation. I made a mental note to leave it alone and went back downstairs. The first time I found it open, I blamed the house. Old homes shift, latches slip. I'd gone up to fetch an old box of photographs and found the small door slightly ajar, a sliver of perfect, silent darkness beyond it. I felt a faint, cool draft. Without a second thought, I pushed it closed. It clicked shut with a sound that was surprisingly definite. A week later, it was open again. This time, I paused. I stood in the middle of the attic, listening. The house was silent. The wind was still. There was no reason for it to be open. I walked over, my footsteps echoing softly on the floorboards. The darkness behind the door seemed deeper this time, more absolute. I felt a prickle of unease, the kind you get when you feel you're being watched. I pushed it shut again, harder this time. I even jiggled the latch to make sure it was secure. It was. This was the first turning point, the moment my rational mind began to lose its footing. The problem became a quiet obsession. I would go up to the attic every morning, my heart a little tighter in my chest. More often than not, the door would be open. Not wide open, never that. Just ajar, as if someone had just slipped through and hadn't quite closed it behind them. I tried to solve it. I wedged a thick book against it. The next day, the book was sitting neatly on the floor a few inches away, and the door was open. I tried a rubber doorstop. It was moved, too. The unsettling part was the neatness of it. Nothing was ever thrown or disturbed. It was simply set aside, as if to say, this doesn't belong here. My unease curdled into a low, simmering dread. The quiet of the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. I started hearing things, or thinking I did. A soft scraping sound from above in the dead of night. A floorboard creaking in the attic when I was in the kitchen. I told myself it was my imagination, that the house and its stubborn little door were making me paranoid. The second reveal came after I installed the lock. I'd had enough. I went to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty slide bolt, the kind you use for a cellar door or a garden shed. I spent an afternoon in the attic, the smell of sawdust and my own nervous sweat filling the air. I drilled the holes, my hands shaking almost imperceptibly. I screwed the bolt firmly into the old wood of the door and its frame. When I was done, I slid the thick metal bolt into place. The sound it made a solid, metallic thunk was the most reassuring thing I had heard in weeks. It was final. It was secure. That night, I slept better than I had in a month. I felt victorious. I had imposed my will on the house. I had locked the secret away. The next morning, I made my coffee and, with a sense of grim satisfaction, went to the pull-down stairs. I ascended into the dusty light. I looked toward the far end of the attic. The bolt was still in place, but it was slid back. It wasn't broken. It wasn't forced. The screws were still tight. The metal was unscratched. The bolt had been smoothly, deliberately, and silently slid from the locked position to the unlocked position, and the door, as always, was ajar. I didn't go any closer. I stood there, frozen, staring at the impossible fact of it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't a faulty latch. This wasn't the house settling. Something had slid that bolt open. Something that was inside, with me. The logic was inescapable and terrifying. From that day on, the house felt truly occupied. The presence was no longer subtle. I started smelling things. A faint, inexplicable scent of damp earth and cold air, as if a window had been left open in the middle of winter, even when everything was sealed tight. The sound of scraping became more distinct, like heavy canvas being dragged slowly across unfinished wood. It always came from the attic, always from the direction of the little door. I stopped going up there altogether. I tried to pretend the attic didn't exist, but I knew. I knew the door was open. I could feel it, a cold spot in the geography of my home, a wound that wouldn't close. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a cage I shared with something else. Sleep became difficult. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the normal sounds of the house, trying to convince myself that they were the only sounds. But always, eventually, I would hear it, the faint, distant creak from above, a sound that my mind now tied to that small, open door. The confrontation, the third and final reveal, was not a choice. It was an inevitability. After a week of sleepless nights, of living on a knife's edge of fear, I knew I couldn't go on like this. The not knowing was worse than any possible reality. I had to see what was behind the door. One night, armed with the brightest flashlight I owned, I pulled down the attic stairs for the last time. Every step was a conscious effort. The air in the attic was colder than I had ever felt it, and the smell of damp earth was overpowering. The dragging sound was absent. There was only silence. The small door at the far end was open, as I knew it would be. It gaped at me, a rectangle of pure black. My hand trembled as I raised the flashlight. I took a step forward, then another. The floorboards seemed to groan in protest. I reached the door and hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs. I aimed the beam of light into the opening. I was expecting a crawl space, bricks, pipes, insulation. What I saw instead made the air leave my lungs in a choked gasp. It wasn't a crawl space, it was the attic. I was looking into a perfect reflection of the room I was standing in. I could see the chimney trunk, the slope of the roof, the dusty floorboards. It was an exact replica, stretching out into the darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the identical space, but something was terribly wrong. The air in there was visibly colder, shimmering slightly, and everything was coated in a fine, gray dust that absorbed the light. It was a dead, silent, negative image of the attic. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A mirror? No, there was no glass. It was a space, a real, physical space that shouldn't exist. My beam traveled the length of the silent, mirrored room to the far wall. And there, on the far wall of this other attic, was another small door, a perfect copy of the one I was looking through. And as I watched, frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated terror, that other door, the one at the far end of the impossible room, began to creak slowly open. It opened inward into a darkness deeper than anything I had ever seen, and from that darkness a shape began to emerge. It wasn't a monster of teeth and claws. It was a silhouette, a void in the shape of a person, but it was tall and unnaturally thin, and it moved with a disjointed, twitching grace that was utterly wrong. It didn't have a face, only a smooth, dark surface where a face should be. It took one slow, deliberate step into the gray, mirrored attic, then another. It was coming toward me. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure horror. I stumbled backward, my legs refusing to hold me. I scrambled away, crab walking through the dust, my flashlight falling and rolling across the floor, its beam spinning wildly. I half fell, half tumbled down the pull-down stairs, collapsing onto the hallway floor below. I slammed the attic entrance shut, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. Who would I sell it to? What would I say? There's an impossible room in the attic with a copy of you made of shadow that wants to come out? I couldn't leave, either. The fear was a strange anchor. I felt, in some deep, illogical part of my soul, that whatever was up there was tied to me now, that if I left, it would somehow follow. I live here still. I never go into the upstairs hallway. I sealed the pull-down staircase with nails and paint, but I know it's a pointless gesture. I don't try to fight it anymore. I have surrendered. The house and I have reached a quiet understanding. I stay on the ground floor. I don't acknowledge the upstairs. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the world outside is asleep, I hear it. The faint, familiar creak of a small wooden door, swinging gently open in the cold, dark air above. I no longer feel terror when I hear it. There is nothing left for that. There is only a profound, psychic numbness, a quiet resignation. The last door in the attic never stays shut. I know that now. It's waiting. It will always be waiting, and I just live beneath it, listening. Story 2. I stayed one night in room 313. They give you a key card for the room, but they don't tell you what the room keeps for itself. The road is a relentless hypnotist. For 14 hours, it had held me in its trance, a monotonous gray ribbon spooling endlessly into the darkness. I was running not from the law, not from anyone in particular, but from the crushing weight of a life that had collapsed under its own silence. I thought 1,000 miles of asphalt could put a meaningful distance between me and a ghost, but I was learning that ghosts don't care about mileage. They are experts at keeping pace. My eyelids felt like sandpaper. The white lines on the highway had started to blur, melting into shimmering worms of light. Delirium was setting in, and the loneliness of the vast, empty plains of Middle America was becoming a palpable presence in the passenger seat. Then, like a mirage, a sign shimmered in my high beams. The Sleepy Hollow Motel. Vacancy. Its neon buzz was a sickly magenta, flickering as if the sign itself were having a seizure. It was the first sign of human settlement I'd seen in what felt like a lifetime. It would have to do. Pulling off the highway felt like waking from a dream. The motel was a relic, a 2-story, L-shaped structure that had been left behind by the interstate system and time itself. The paint, once a cheerful white, was now a leprous patchwork of gray and pale green. It sagged under the weight of the immense, star-filled sky. I parked my car, the only vehicle in the cracked and weed-choked lot, and the crunch of my tires on the gravel sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. The office was a small, fluorescent-lit box that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The man behind the counter was a perfect match for his establishment. His face was a roadmap of weary resignation, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He didn't greet me. I asked for a room, and he simply spun a tarnished metal stand around to face me, revealing a stack of key card. 35, he mumbled, his voice raspy, as if from disuse. I paid with cash. He took the bills without a word, his fingers dry and cool like parchment. He slid a key card across the scarred Formica counter. Room 313, he said, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall somewhere behind my left shoulder. Top floor, end of the walkway. Ice machines broke. There was a finality to his tone that discouraged any further questions. I took the key card and left, the little bell on the door offering a cheerful, incongruous jingle into the cold night air. The concrete walkway on the second floor was cold and damp, despite the arid weather. It amplified my footsteps, making me feel like an intruder in a place long abandoned. The doors to the other rooms were all a uniform, faded maroon, their numbers stenciled in flaking white paint. Every window was a black, vacant square. I walked to the very end, where room 313 huddled in the deepest shadows, just beyond the reach of the last buzzing security light. The key card reader beeped a sickly green. I pushed the door open, and a wave of cold, stagnant air washed over me. It was the sterile chill of an overworked air conditioner mixed with something else, something older and sweeter. The room was a diorama of transient loneliness. 2 queen beds with stiff, geometric, patterned bedspreads, a dark wood dresser bolted to the wall, and a cheap painting of a placid seascape hanging noticeably crooked. I dropped my bag by the door, the thud muffled by the thin, worn carpet. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound seemed to sever my last tie to the outside world. The silence inside the room was different from the silence outside. It was heavier, pressurized. The faint, sweet smell I'd noticed at the door was stronger in here. It was a cloying, floral scent, like old perfume or dying flowers. It seemed to have soaked into the very fabric of the room, the curtains, the carpet, the stiff bedspreads. I crossed to the window and pulled back the thick, vinyl curtain. It looked out over the empty parking lot and the dark ribbon of the highway beyond. I was alone up here. I saw the light in the office flick off, plunging the entire property into a deeper darkness, leaving only the sputtering magenta sign to cast its nervous glow. I let the curtain fall. My first attempt to impose my own presence on the room was to turn on the television. I pressed the power button on the ancient console set. The screen leaped to life with a loud hiss, a blizzard of frantic gray and white static. I methodically pressed the channel up button. Each channel was the same, a roaring, empty snowstorm. I leaned closer, fiddling with the dial. Underneath the loud hiss, I thought I could hear something else, a faint, distorted murmur, like a voice underwater. I told myself it was an auditory illusion, my brain trying to make sense of random noise. I switched it off. The sudden silence was jarring. I decided a shower was my best hope for washing away the road and the unease. The bathroom was a small, claustrophobic space. The linoleum on the floor was cracked, and the grout between the tiles was dark with age. As I turned the knob for the shower, the faucet sputtered, and water began to drip into the tub with an unsteady rhythm. Drip, 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 drip. It would speed up and slow down, as if controlled by an unseen hand. I ignored it and stepped into the shower, letting the scalding water beat down on my tired shoulders. The steam filled the small room, fogging the mirror and making the already close quarters feel suffocating. For a few minutes, with the roar of the water in my ears, the world felt normal. But when I stepped out, the feeling of wrongness returned with a vengeance. The mirror was completely opaque with condensation. I wiped a large circle in the center with my towel so I could see my own reflection, a stranger with tired eyes. I turned away to dry off, and when I looked back at the mirror a moment later, I saw it. In the very center of the circle I had just wiped clean, there was a handprint. It was small and slender, the fingers delicately defined in the returning fog. It was the print of a woman's hand, pressed firmly against the glass from my side. From inside the room, my heart stopped. It hadn't been there a second ago. I stared, mesmerized and horrified, before wiping the entire mirror clean with a frantic motion of my towel. This was the second turning point, the moment plausible deniability evaporated. The house settling, the faulty wiring, the tricks of a tired mind, all of those comforting explanations were gone. Something was in the room with me. I dressed quickly, my skin crawling. I left the bathroom light on, its flickering hum, a flimsy shield against the encroaching dread. I had to sleep. Exhaustion was a physical pain. I chose the bed farthest from the door and slid between the cold, stiff sheets. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening. The only sound was the unsteady hum of the air conditioner and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I don't know how long I lay there, suspended in a state of hyper-awareness. It might have been minutes or an hour. The room was so dark that my eyes couldn't adjust. It was an absolute suffocating blackness. And in that blackness, I heard a floorboard creak, a soft groan of old wood just beside my bed. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The silence stretched, taut and thin. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, and impossibly loud in the silence. It was the unmistakable sound of the deadbolt on the door sliding into the locked position. I hadn't touched it. I never used deadbolts in motels. I only used the chain, a habit born of a lifetime of caution, and I hadn't even done that. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. A quiet, rational part of my brain calmly informed me that I was trapped. I slowly, carefully, sat up in bed, my muscles screaming in protest. I peered through the darkness toward the door, but it was just an amorphous shape in the black. Then, my gaze was drawn to the other bed, the empty one just a few feet away. An indentation was forming on the mattress. It appeared with an agonizing slowness. It wasn't sudden. It was a gradual depression, as if a person of considerable weight was gently, deliberately, sitting down on the edge of the bed. I could hear the faint, dry rustle of the bedspread fabric and the soft sigh of the old springs as they took the unseen burden. My throat closed up. I tried to scream, but only a choked, pathetic whimper escaped. I was staring at the physical proof of an invisible presence, right here, in my locked room. Paralyzed, I watched the dip in the other bed. The cloying smell of perfume intensified dramatically, billowing through the air like a toxic cloud. It was so thick I could taste it, a sickeningly sweet flavor on my tongue. The weight on the other bed shifted, and I heard the whisper. It wasn't a sound from across the room. It was a voice, a breath, right beside my ear. It was a dry, sibilant whisper, the sound of desiccated lungs drawing in air and letting it out in a long, mournful sigh. It was a sound of immense sadness and of immense hunger. My eyes, wide with terror, shot to the bathroom. In my peripheral vision, I had caught a flicker of movement. The door, which I had left wide open with the light on, was now slowly, silently, creaking shut. It moved with a smooth, unnatural grace, pulled by an unseen hand. As it closed, it cut off the flickering light from the bathroom, plunging the room into a darkness that felt final. It clicked shut, and the sound echoed the deadbolt locking me in. I was in its space now. The trap was sprung. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body locked tight. I was waiting for a touch, for the whisper to turn into words, for the weight on the other bed to move onto mine. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a new light flickered in the room. I forced my eyes open. The television screen had turned on by itself. It wasn't showing static anymore. It was showing an image, a grainy, low-resolution, black and white image, like old security footage. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing. The camera angle was from up high, near the ceiling, looking down. It was showing the room. It was showing my bed. It was showing me. I could see my own shape, frozen under the covers. And next to me, lying on the bed where I lay, was a dark, indistinct shape, a smudge of blackness. As I watched, horrified, the shape on the screen began to move. It rose up slowly, a formless silhouette, and it leaned over the figure that was me. I finally found my scream. It was a raw, primal sound torn from the depths of my soul. But the scream on my lips was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. I don't remember the rest of the night. It's a black hole in my memory, a void of pure, undiluted terror. My next conscious thought was of the dawn. A thin gray light was seeping through the edges of the curtain, the first hint of morning. As the light touched the room, the TV screen flickered and died. The oppressive weight in the air lifted. The suffocating smell of perfume was gone. The presence had retreated with the darkness. I didn't wait. I scrambled out of bed, my body shaking so violently I could barely stand. I didn't gather my things. I fumbled with the locks on the door, my fingers clumsy and useless. The deadbolt slid back with a grating sound. I wrenched the door open and fled, half sobbing, down the cold concrete walkway and into the safety of the morning. I drove for an hour before I could breathe properly. The sun was up, the world was normal again, but the room is with me now. It's a permanent tenant in my mind. The horror is no longer confined to room 313. It's portable. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I can still smell it. A faint, sweet whiff of old perfume drifting from the empty passenger seat. And out of the corner of my eye, I will sometimes see it, a slight depression in the seat cushion, as if someone is sitting there, patiently, waiting for the next stop, for the next dark room. I just keep driving, but I know I'm not running from a ghost anymore. I'm just its chauffeur. Story 3. She kept knocking, even after the funeral. Grief is a ghost of its own, but some ghosts learn how to use their hands. The silence was the first thing I noticed after everyone had left. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow, architectural one. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. For 12 years, this space had been a duet. Her laughter was the melody, my quiet humming the harmony. Her footsteps on the hardwood, the clink of her favorite ceramic mug, the soft rustle of pages as she read in bed, these were the sounds that had built our home. Now, with one of the voices silenced, the acoustics were all wrong. My own movements were jarring, clumsy intrusions into a profound and sacred quiet. Her things were everywhere, a landscape of memories. Her half-finished novel lay on the nightstand, a bookmark patiently holding her place. Her scent, a mix of lavender and old books, lingered in the closet. I moved through the rooms like a tourist in my own life, touching the objects she had touched, trying to feel some residual warmth. But they were just things, cold and still. Grief, I was learning, is a thief that takes more than just a person. It steals the life from the objects they leave behind. I was prepared for the phantom pains of loss. I expected to hear her call my name in a crowded store, to turn and share a joke with an empty space on the couch. My mind, I knew, would conjure her to fill the void. I was not prepared for how literally it would take that job. It began on the third night. I was adrift in that gray ocean between wakefulness and sleep, my mind a churning sea of memories. Then I heard it, cutting through the fog. Tap, tap, tap. It was on the bedroom door, a sound so specific, so deeply ingrained in the muscle memory of my heart, that I sat bolt upright. It was her knock, her signal, the gentle, hesitant inquiry she would make when she came to bed late, her way of asking, "Are you still with me?" without waking me fully. For one wild, ecstatic second, rational thought ceased to exist. A wave of impossible hope surged through me, so powerful it made me dizzy. It was all a nightmare, a terrible, elaborate dream. She's home. I threw back the covers, my feet hitting the cold floor. I didn't feel the chill. I rushed to the door, my hand closing around the cool brass knob. I felt like I was opening a door back into my real life. I pulled it open. The hallway was dark and empty. The only light was the faint, amber glow of the nightlight near the baseboard, casting long, lonely shadows that bent around the corner. The air was still and cool. There was nothing, no one. The hope shattered, and the wave of grief that followed was more brutal than anything I had yet experienced. It was a physical blow. I leaned my forehead against the doorframe, a ragged sob escaping my throat. It was my mind. It had to be. A trick of a grieving brain, clinging so desperately to a familiar pattern that it had conjured it from the silence. An auditory hallucination. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a final gunshot, and stumbled back to the vast, cold emptiness of the bed. That was the first time, the first turning point. The moment my grief began to feel like a presence rather than an absence. I spent the next day in a haze, trying to fortify my mind against the night. I researched the phenomena of grief, reading about auditory and tactile hallucinations. It was common, the article said, a normal part of the process. This clinical explanation was a comfort, a flimsy shield I held up against the memory of the sound. That night, I left a fan on. The white noise, a deliberate bulwark against the silence. It didn't matter. Around the same time, just past midnight, I heard it again. Faintly, through the whirring of the fan blades. Tap, 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 on the bedroom door. Patient, persistent. I didn't get up this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white as I gripped the blanket. "You're not real," I whispered into my pillow. "You're just in my head." The knocking stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse, because now I was listening for it. The knocking became a nightly ritual. I began to dread the sunset. The house, once a sanctuary, transformed into an echo chamber for my loss. I tried to fight back. One night, I sat in a chair facing the bedroom door, waiting. When the knock came, I shouted, "I hear you. I know it's not real." There was only silence in return. But the next night, it was back, as if my protest had meant nothing. The second reveal, the one that dismantled all my rationalizations, happened a week later. The knocking loop. I was in the kitchen, staring into the refrigerator, trying to remember what eating felt like. The house was completely silent. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't on the bedroom door. It was coming from the front of the house. From the front door. I froze, a carton of milk growing heavy in my hand. It was the same rhythm, her rhythm, but it was at the entrance to our home. A flicker of that same insane hope ignited in my chest. What if? I put the milk down and walked slowly, hesitantly, through the living room. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached the door and, Instead of opening it, I pressed my eye to the peephole. The fisheye lens showed the empty porch, bathed in the cool, yellow light of the single bulb. A moth fluttered erratically around the light fixture. There was no one there. But as I watched, I heard the knock again, louder this time, as if the person were right on the other side of the door. The sound vibrated through the wood into my skull, but the porch remained empty. My shield of clinical explanations shattered. This wasn't a memory replaying in my head. A hallucination doesn't vibrate through solid oak. This was something else, something external. The following evening, I heard it on the glass of the window in the study. The day after that, a faint, rhythmic tapping from the door that led to the basement. It was moving through the house, testing its boundaries, a familiar ghost exploring a familiar home. But it no longer felt like her. It felt like an imitation, a cruel mimicry designed to wound. The fear truly took root when it came from inside the closet. I was curled on the couch, trying to read, the house quiet. The sound came from the hall closet, not 10 feet from where I sat. It was muffled by the thin wooden door. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. My breath caught in my throat. This was a violation of a fundamental rule. The knocking had always come from a threshold, a boundary between outside and in. The bedroom door, the front door, the window. But the closet was inside. It was inside the house with me. It was no longer something trying to get in. It was already here. The final, terrifying confrontation was an escalation I could not have predicted. The nature of the knocking changed. It shed the skin of her gentle rhythm and became something monstrous. It started one evening as a frantic, desperate pounding on the front door. I huddled in the living room, listening. Then it started on the back door simultaneously. Then the windows, a sharp, frantic rapping on the glass. Soon, it was everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. The entire house became a drum, beaten by 1,000 unseen, relentless hands. It was a cacophony of sound, a psychic assault that hammered at the foundations of my sanity. The noise was interspersed with other sounds, now a high-pitched scratching on the windows, the violent rattling of doorknobs in their sockets. I collapsed onto the floor, curling into a ball, my hands clamped over my ears. The sound vibrated through my bones. It was a physical presence. I was being besieged. A scream built in my chest, a scream of grief and rage and pure animal terror. "What do you want?" I shrieked into the chaos. "Leave me alone!" And it stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more deafening than the noise. The abrupt absence of vibration left my body humming. I lay on the floor, trembling, my ears ringing in the stillness. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on for a full minute. Then, a single sound broke the stillness. Tap, tap, tap. It was quiet, slow, deliberate, and it came from the plush cushion of the armchair right next to my head. I didn't flee. Where would I go? The haunting wasn't in the house. It was in the memory of her, a memory it had hijacked. Fleeing would be like trying to outrun my own shadow. I had nowhere to go. I now live in a state beyond fear, a quiet, gray landscape of numb resignation. The knocking is my constant companion. It has returned to its soft, patient rhythm, her rhythm. Sometimes as I'm washing dishes, I'll hear it on the glass of the cabinet door. As I pass the hall closet, a soft tap, tap, tap will sound from within. I no longer acknowledge it. I no longer speak to it. We are simply roommates in the house of my grief. Most nights, I lie awake in my bed for hours. I don't read. I don't listen to music. I just wait, and it always comes. It no longer knocks on the door. It knocks on the headboard, just above my head. Sometimes it knocks on the empty side of the bed, on the pillow where she used to sleep. A gentle, persistent inquiry. Tap, tap, tap. I never answer. I just lie there, wide awake in the suffocating darkness, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I listen to the echo of a love that has become a monstrous thing, a ghost that has learned my name and will never, ever let me go. It is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it knows I'm listening. Story 4. The lake is quiet in October, too quiet. Nature has its own rhythms, its own sounds. The most terrifying sound is the absence of them all. My life had become a symphony of noise. The shriek of sirens, the incessant hum of servers, the constant chatter of voices demanding my time and attention. I was burned out, a hollowed out version of myself, and I craved an antidote. I craved silence, not the dead silence of an empty apartment, but the living silence of nature. I imagined a place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the call of a bird, a place to reset my soul. I found it in a brochure, a small isolated cabin on the shore of a remote lake, deep in a mountain range several states away. The photos showed a rustic wooden box nestled amongst towering pines, a private dock stretching out into pristine blue water. Your autumn sanctuary, the caption read. I booked it for 2 weeks in the middle of October, a time I knew would be free of summer crowds and buzzing motorboats. The journey itself was a process of shedding civilization. Highways gave way to 2-lane roads, which narrowed into winding country lanes. The last 10 miles were on a gravel road, my car kicking up a plume of dust that was the only sign of movement in the vast, silent landscape. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as the brochure had promised, a perfect, cozy little refuge. A curl of smoke was already rising from its stone chimney, a thoughtful touch from the owner who had left the key for me. I stood on the porch, a mug of tea warming my hands, and I listened. This was it, the silence, but as the minutes stretched on, a thread of unease began to stitch itself into my contentment. It was too perfect, too absolute. The wind sighed through the tops of the immense pines, a sound like a distant ocean, but down here, at the forest floor, there was nothing. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering or rustling in the undergrowth, no drone of late-season insects. The world was holding its breath. I shook it off. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? An escape from the noise. I was simply unaccustomed to it. I decided to explore the woods that bordered the property. I stepped off the porch and onto a carpet of pine needles that didn't crunch under my boots. They were damp and soft, muffling my steps. As I walked deeper into the forest, the silence intensified. The air was cold and still. The trees stood like ancient, silent sentinels. I looked at the ground, hoping to see a sign of life, a deer track, a rabbit dropping, anything. There was nothing. The forest floor was strangely barren. Then I saw it, a bird's nest, resting in the crook of a low-hanging branch. It was perfectly made, an intricate little bowl of twigs and moss, but it was empty. And directly below it, on the ground, were 3 small, pale blue eggs. They weren't broken, they were perfectly intact, as if they had been gently placed there. As if a mother bird, in the middle of her most vital, instinctual task, had simply stopped, vanished. The image was so profoundly wrong, so contrary to every law of nature, that a chill unrelated to the autumn air crawled up my spine. I turned back and walked quickly to the cabin. My sanctuary was beginning to feel like a stage, perfectly set but waiting for the actors who would never arrive. My gaze fell upon the lake. It was vast, stretching for miles, its surface a flawless, dark mirror reflecting the bruised purple and gray of the overcast sky. A slight breeze was picking up, rustling my hair and the leaves on the shoreline trees. But the lake's surface remained utterly, impossibly still. It did not ripple, it did not lap against the shore. It was a solid thing, a sheet of polished obsidian. This was the first true reveal. The silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was an active, enforced presence, and its source seemed to be the lake. The next day, I couldn't stand the oppressive quiet any longer. I decided I had to defy it. I had to force a sound into this world. The cabin came with an old aluminum canoe, and I dragged it down the grassy slope to the water's edge. The motion should have made a scraping sound on the pebbles of the shore, but it was muted, dull. I pushed the bow into the water. There was no splash. The water parted around it silently, like thick oil. I climbed in, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The canoe felt unsteady in the strangely viscous water. I took the paddle and pushed off from the shore. My first stroke into the water was met with an unnerving lack of sound. There was no gurgle, no splash, no satisfying drip of water as I lifted the paddle. The canoe slid forward through the glassy water without a whisper. My own breathing sounded like a hurricane in my ears. It was the only sound in the world. I paddled toward the center of the lake, a growing dread coiling in my stomach. The silence here was different. It felt deeper, older. It felt like a living thing, and I was trespassing in its heart. I stopped paddling and let the canoe drift. The stillness that descended was absolute. I looked down. The water was dark, but exceptionally clear. Below me, perhaps 20 feet down, was the lake bed, and it was not empty. It was covered in them, long, dark, upright shapes. They were rooted to the bottom, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, swaying ever so slightly in a current that didn't exist. At first, I thought they were a strange type of submerged tree, a petrified forest. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw their form. They had torsos and limbs and what looked disturbingly like heads. They were vaguely human-like, but elongated and thin, their forms blurred by the water. They were a drowned congregation, a silent, waiting army. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were the source of the quiet. They were the sentinels. They were drinking the sound from the world. Terror, pure and undiluted, seized me. I began to paddle, my movements frantic and desperate. The canoe shot forward, still silent, but my mind was screaming. I felt their collective gaze on me from the depths, a cold, heavy pressure. I didn't stop until the bow of the canoe scraped against the shore, the first real sound I had heard, and I scrambled out, falling onto the grass, gasping for air. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I became a creature of the dark, huddled in the cabin, peering out the large picture window that overlooked the lake. As dusk bled into night, a thick, white mist began to rise from the center of the lake, right above where the drowned forest stood. The mist swirled and coalesced, unnaturally thick. Then came the final, awful confrontation. From the heart of the mist, a figure rose. It wasn't ghostly, it was solid, a silhouette of pure black against the pale mist. It was tall and unnaturally thin, like the shapes below, and it wasn't swimming or floating. It was standing on the surface of the water. It stood motionless for a long time, a statue of silence. Then another figure emerged from the mist to stand beside it, and another. Soon there were a dozen of them, standing on the water, their featureless heads all turned toward the shore. They were not looking at the cabin. They seemed to be looking at me. They were the guardians, risen from the depths to observe the intruder. There was no malice in their stance, no overt threat. There was only a calm, absolute authority. The quiet was their domain, and I had trespassed. I had heard their secret. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the bathroom, the only room without a window, listening to the crushing weight of the enforced silence. Once, I heard a single, soft thump against the outside wall of the cabin. It was a quiet, almost gentle sound, but it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard, because it was a deliberate act in a world where sound was forbidden. It was a reminder that they knew exactly where I was. I waited for the dawn like a condemned man waiting for a pardon. The moment the first sliver of gray light appeared in the small bathroom window, I ran. I didn't take my bag, my wallet, or my keys. I burst out the front door and sprinted to my car. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking too much to fit the key in the lock. The lake was behind me, still and glassy. The mist and the figures were gone. I finally got the car started and sped away, spitting gravel, not looking back. I drove for miles, the silence still clinging to me, a suffocating shroud. Then I rolled down my window. The cool morning air rushed in, and I heard it, a single cricket chirping its defiant song from the side of the road. The sound was so normal, so beautifully, vibrantly alive, that it broke me. I pulled the car over to the shoulder of the road and wept, great, racking sobs of terror and relief. I live in the city now. I surround myself with noise. I have a television in every room, and they are always on. I sleep with 2 fans and a white noise machine. I cannot bear silence. A quiet room feels like a pressure chamber. A moment of stillness feels like a prelude to a darker quiet. I never go to the countryside. I cannot look at pictures of lakes. I know I didn't escape. You can't escape a memory like that. You just carry it. I carry the memory of that absolute, perfect, and malevolent silence. I know that the lake is still there, and the silent guardians are still keeping their watch, waiting for the world to fall quiet enough for them to rise again. Story 5. Something moves beneath the floorboards at night. The realtor told me the original hardwood floors were the house's best feature. She didn't mention they were already occupied. I had signed the lease without a second thought. The apartment was assigned the top floor of a narrow, 3-story brownstone in a historic part of the city. It had character, which was my polite euphemism for being old and slightly decrepit. It had high ceilings, drafty sash windows, and a charmingly impractical fireplace. But the floors were magnificent. They were wide planks of dark, almost black wood, worn smooth by more than a century of life. They groaned and creaked with a dignified sort of protest when I walked on them, sounds I interpreted as the house's welcome. For the first week, that's what they were, the charming, predictable sounds of an old home. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I had moved for a new job, a new start, and the solitude was a welcome blanket after years of noisy roommates. The nights were quiet, the city sounds muted by the thick brick walls. I would lie in bed, listening to the gentle groans of the floorboards as they cooled and settled, and I would feel a sense of peace. I was home, safe. The first time I heard it, I was sure it was raccoons. It was a faint, intermittent scratching sound. It came from beneath the floor, somewhere in the vicinity of the far wall of my bedroom. It was the sound of tiny claws on dry, ancient timber. I lay awake, listening. It would scratch for a few seconds, pause, and then start again in a slightly different spot. Pests, an unfortunate but common problem in an old building. I made a mental note to call the landlord and rolled over, pulling the pillow over my head. The sound continued for the next 2 nights, always starting around 3 in the morning, that dead, silent hour when the world seems to hold its breath. I bought a few mouse traps, feeling a little guilty as I set them in the corners of the bedroom. The next morning, the traps were exactly as I had left them, empty, the bait untouched. Yet that night, the scratching returned, as faint and persistent as ever. I called the landlord, a gruff, perpetually inconvenienced man named Mr. Corbin. He was unmoved by my complaint. "It's an old house," he'd grunted over the phone, his voice thick with annoyance. "You get squirrels, mice, God knows what else in the walls. They'll move on. Just bang on the floor a bit if it bothers you." His dismissal left me feeling foolish, but also strangely alone. It was my problem then. That night, when the scratching started, I did as he said. I sat up in bed and banged my fist on the wooden floor beside me. The scratching stopped. Instantly, I waited, listening, a sense of minor victory swelling in my chest. The silence stretched. Then, from directly beneath the spot where my fist had struck, came a soft, dry, scraping sound. It was different from the frantic scratching of a small animal. This was slower, more deliberate. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across rough wood. This was the first turning point, the moment the problem shifted from mundane to unsettling. The sound was no longer that of a pest. It felt responsive. The next night, the frantic scratching did not return. Instead, the new sound was back, the slow, dragging noise. It began near the far wall, just as before, but this time it didn't stay in one place. It moved. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining in the darkness, and I could trace its path. It was moving slowly, purposefully, from the wall toward the center of the room, directly toward my bed. The sound was a low, resonant shh of friction, like a heavy burlap sack filled with sand being pulled across the joist beneath me. I held my breath, listening as it traveled the length of the room. It moved directly under my bed, paused for a long, terrifying moment, and then continued its slow journey toward the opposite wall, where it eventually faded into silence. The entire event lasted maybe 10 minutes. It was methodical. It was a patrol. The next morning, I noticed the second sign, the one that proved the boundary between my space and the space below was not as solid as I believed. Along the seams of the dark floorboards, tracing the exact path the dragging sound had taken, was a fine, dark powder. It looked like a mixture of dry soil and sawdust. I knelt, my heart pounding, and touched it. It was gritty and cold, and it had a strange, faint smell, the smell of damp earth, of a cellar that hadn't been opened in 100 years. I cleaned it up, scrubbing the floorboards until they shone. I told myself it was just vibrations from the movement below, shaking loose a century of dust and grime from the subfloor. It was a flimsy explanation, and I knew it. That night, the dragging sound returned. It followed the same path, a slow, deliberate transit across the geography of my bedroom. And the next morning, the dark, loamy dust was back, a perfect, pale line drawn across my floor. It was a trail, a signpost. My sense of peace in the apartment was gone, replaced by a constant, low-grade dread. I started dreading nightfall. I would play music, leave the lights on, anything to distract myself. But eventually I had to go to bed, to lie in the darkness and wait for my unseen roommate to begin its nightly promenade. I felt like I was living on the ceiling of someone else's room. The third escalation, the one that shattered my sanity, came a week later. I had been woken by the dragging sound, and I was filled with a sudden, desperate anger. I was a prisoner in my own home, terrorized by a noise. I leaped out of bed and stood on the spot where the sound was loudest, right next to my bed. "Stop it!" I shouted at the floor, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Whatever you are, stop it!" I stamped my foot down, hard. The old floorboard shuddered under the impact. The dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with tension. I stood there, trembling, my bare feet cold on the wood. I waited. 1 second, 2, 10. Thump. The sound was a single, hard, solid impact against the floorboards directly beneath my feet. It was so powerful, I felt the vibration shoot up through the bones of my legs. It wasn't an echo of my own stomp. It was a response, a clear, concise, and utterly terrifying communication. It said, "I am here, and I hear you." I scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child. The rest of the night was silent. The dragging sound did not return, but the silence was worse. It was a shared silence now, a silence that acknowledged my presence as much as I acknowledged its. I knew I couldn't live like this. The not knowing was a cancer on my mind. I couldn't call the landlord again. He would think I was insane. I couldn't break my lease without a reason he would accept. I had to know. I had to see. The next day, I didn't go to work. I waited until the sun was high in the sky, streaming through the windows, making the apartment feel as safe as it possibly could. My target was the closet. The floorboards in there were just as old, but less polished, and one of them near the back corner had always felt a little loose. Armed with a crowbar and a heavy-duty flashlight, I went to work. The board groaned in protest, but it came up with a final, splintering shriek. A wave of cold, earthy air washed over me, the smell I recognized from the fine dust, but 100 times more potent. I knelt, my heart hammering, and aimed the powerful beam of the flashlight into the darkness below. I was looking into the subfloor, the space between my apartment and the ceiling of the unit below. It was a cavern of thick, ancient wooden joists and crossbeams, like the ribs of some great, fossilized beast. But the ground below them, the true bottom of the space, wasn't what I expected. It wasn't planks or plaster. It was dirt, dark, damp, naked earth. My light beam cut through the gloom. I could see the evidence of the scratching, countless tiny marks on the sides of the joists. But it was the dragging that drew my attention. In the soft earth between the beams, there were long, deep furrows, as if something heavy and wide had been methodically plowed through the dirt, night after night. The furrows formed a clear, repeating path, the very same one I had traced from my bed. My light followed the path to the center of the space, to the area directly beneath where my bed stood, and there, my blood turned to ice. In the dark earth, there was a depression. It was a shallow, oblong hollow, roughly the length and width of a human body. It looked like a freshly dug, shallow grave, or a bed. As I stared, transfixed by a horror that defied words, a clump of dirt at the edge of the depression trembled. Then another. The earth itself was moving. It wasn't crumbling or settling. It was contracting and shifting, coalescing with a slow, deliberate motion. Clumps of soil, dark roots, and fragments of ancient debris began to knit together, rising from the hollow. It formed a shape, a vague, terrifying parody of a human form made of packed earth and darkness. It was a golem of subfloor detritus. It slowly sat up in its earthen bed, its movements sluggish and ancient. It had no features, no face, no eyes, but a head-like shape, a lumpy sphere of packed soil, slowly turned in the darkness, swiveling towards the sliver of light from the hole I had created. Towards me, a strangled gasp escaped my lips. I dropped the flashlight. It fell into the darkness with a soft thud, and I slammed the floorboard back into place. I didn't care about the noise. I stumbled out of the closet and kicked the door shut. I backed away, my eyes wide, until my back hit the opposite wall. I didn't leave. The terrifying logic of the situation paralyzed me. I lived on the top floor. Below me was another apartment. Below that, the ground floor. What I had seen was not in the building's foundation. It was in the building. It was in the space between the floors. It had made its home there. I don't remember the rest of that day. I think I sat on the couch, staring at the bedroom door, until the sun went down and the room filled with shadows. I eventually crawled into bed, an act of sheer, exhausted surrender. I lie here now, in the dark. The silence of the house presses in on me. It has been an hour since I turned off the light. I know it will start soon. The slow, patient journey from one side of the room to the other. But tonight, the sound will not be a mystery. It will not be rats or pipes or the settling of an old house. I know what it is now. It's the sound of my neighbor, the one who lives downstairs. Not the tenant in 2B, the one who lives in the narrow, dark space between us. I can almost hear the soft whisper of the dirt, the slow, heavy drag of a body made of earth, pacing in its bedroom just below mine. I lie perfectly still. I regulate my breathing. I don't dare move a muscle. I don't stamp on the floor anymore. I've learned my lesson. You don't knock on a neighbor's door unless you want them to answer. And I know, with a certainty that has settled deep in my bones, that some neighbors should never, ever be disturbed.